Welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And I am very happy to introduce my guest today, who is Daniel Bourke. And his book is this one with a very intriguing title, Apparitions at the Moment of Death. So I couldn't resist having you here. Hello, Daniel.
Hello, Anna. Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
I'm looking at the title of this book. Obviously, it was begging for attention. So my first question is, why did you feel the need to write this?
Well, the reason I felt the need to write it was that it didn't necessarily exist already. And I have always been I've always been interested in these experiences. And as I kind of made my way through the literature, you realize that there are references to cross-cultural accounts. There are references to the phenomenon of what are called crisis apparitions as they appear in Scotland, the legends of Iceland, the forerunners of Canada, for example. There are these kind of sporadic references, but there was not one place where I could go to read many cross-cultural accounts, and also to go far beyond those more kind of generally referenced regions. Like I wanted to take it worldwide, and I just wanted to have a book of cross-cultural and historical crisis apparitions within which the individual could just open any page at any point, and boom, there's an account. So that was actually one of my main goals with that book.
Well, that's the reason you wrote it, is you wanted to have to collate
Mm, pretty
experiences
much.
that were across the world and across
Yeah.
time as well. Why did you feel that it was important to do this?
Well, it's an interesting question. I do feel it's kind of something that's missing from the bookshelves. It is something that's missing from psychical research generally, and not just psychical, but just kind of general history of religion, even research related to those areas. But I didn't necessarily write it because it's this really important book that needs to be written. I just had a passion for it, you know? I just had a, I mean, I just enjoy the accounts. I enjoy the how they impact the individuals. I enjoy how they kind of speak to something beyond the kind of normal conceptions of the individual's idea of what daily life is. Because in these accounts, these apparitions at the moment of death, the individual is faced with a very mysterious form of synchronistic experience. They witness the form, the sound, or another intimation of an individual, often a loved one, at a distance, at what they later discover was the very moment of their distant death. That is something that can trigger a very powerful individual response. It's not always the case, but it's commonly the case. And what's interesting, something that I found interesting, was that this also comes out in in the historical accounts. Also, you'll find these kinds of impacts and after effects, etc.
Well, I do feel that it's important that this book was written, and the reason is that we live in a society where anything that is of a psychic nature or of what's so-called paranormal nature is dismissed, and
Hmm.
imagination, and people are very reluctant to share their experiences, and
Extreme.
yet they are quite common actually. And it's only when you start talking that you discover that you're not on your own,
Mm,
and that this experience that you have does not mean that you're having a psychotic episode.
mm.
That these things do happen. So you kind of started to talk about crisis apparitions there, but just to make things clear for everyone
Mhm.
and for those who are new to this, exactly what is a apparition?
Well, the kind of more strict idea is that a crisis apparition is the experience of encountering the visual form of an individual that you know at a time when they happen to be actually dying at a distance. Now, at the time, you're generally not aware that you're encountering the form of someone who's actually dying, which is fascinating in and of itself, obviously. But and to be more strict even than that, the kind of original parameters were within 12 hours either before or after the death. Now, that was somewhat arbitrary because what's 13 hours before and after death? You know, it doesn't, it's helpful for categorization, but, you know, we have to do these things. But like, that's the fundamental aspect of the experience. Like the individual, it can come in the form of a dream, a seeming apparitional experience, a kind of a waking vision, even a sound, a voice. Um, but the kind of fundamental mystery of it is that the individual will have this experience. They will then either wake up from the dream or go and or get a phone call maybe 5 minutes later, maybe 2 minutes later, and then they get the call that individual has just died. And the experience is mysterious enough in and of itself. Like that fact in and of itself is mysterious enough, but the experience actually kind of presents with a kind of many ancillary mysteries as well, such as the fact that the individual may picture the dying or dead person in the clothing that they were actually wearing at the time, which they couldn't have known. Or, for example, the dying form, the apparitional form may be waving goodbye, or maybe speaking the words goodbye. And of course, even just in a normal hallucination, if we want to use those words, it would be somewhat strange to see somebody waving or emoting goodbye. But the fact that they're doing it in a contextually relevant episode where they actually would be waving goodbye, that speaks to kind of a broader mystery of the crisis apparition, which isn't as well kind of researched. I feel like the actual mystery of it is enough that it's caught attention, such that these other areas haven't been dived into that much yet. But that's kind of the fundamental of it.
So, thinking back to all the accounts that you've read, roughly what would be the oldest account that you came across of this happening?
Well, it's interesting. I can give more than roughly. I can be very specific and say that the oldest account that I have come across was an Egyptian pharaoh, which was from 1963 or 36 is one or the other, but forgive me, the BC, and that was a very it was a kind of it was the pharaoh Senwosruit, and it was written on a stela, a stone stela, and it was written by his son to the pharaoh after he died. The son was the one who had the experience. His father, his palace was raided, and while his son was sleeping somewhere distant, he came to him, told him what had happened, how the fact he had died, and the specifics as to how he had died. And although this is considered a kind of a by many scholars, this is considered a kind of a politically related poem, maybe a kind of a more historical or sociological kind of piece of writing. When I look at that piece of writing, I see the most basic form of a crisis apparition, such that it's almost indistinguishable from, like, for instance, the ghost of Hamlet, who appears and the king reveals his death in basically the same manner. So it's interesting to see those similarities thousands of years apart. And then from there, you could go to, like, the 1960s, David Belasco, playwright. He came up with The Return of Peter Grimm. And then he had an experience very similar where he's lying in his bed. He had the apparitional form of his mother appear to him, and she just kind of simply spoke the words Davy 3 times. That's his name. And he discovered later that she had died at that exact moment at a distance. And that's interesting because you're tying it to the literary accounts like Hamlet and the older accounts like the Stela that we just mentioned. But the similarities are essentially, you know, undeniable. And the importance of that is for others, for everyone to decide. But I consider it to be very important in and of itself.
Yes, because it's very easy to dismiss things from the past as fiction.
Mhm.
But when you consider that what is being described is something that is happening in the present, then it makes it quite credible. So that's very interesting. What other types of apparitions have you come across in your accounts that you've read?
Well, I've in my general research, like, I've come across basically every kind of apparition. Like but what's interesting about the crisis apparition is that we can kind of frame it against those. Like, for example, the general after death communication. That's just the idea that you have a contact with a loved one, a deceased loved one, after they've died. But in those cases, those are incredible, powerful experiences, whatever their ultimate meaning. But the individual at the time knows that they're speaking to a dead person. The same is true often of these accounts of haunter apparitions, the type of kind of classic ghost who's seen around, old houses, or, you know, like the ancient Greek account of the ghost with the rattling chains and stuff. Like, these are the kind of classic poltergeists. But again, in many of those cases, not all though, and it is important to note that, but in many of those cases, we do know that those are dead people. So what sets the crisis apparition apart, and why it's such a powerful experience, is that we're discovering that fact in the moment. We're discovering that fact of the death in the moment, and it's later confirmed. And it's interesting how little work has been done on them, because I don't necessarily know why. There was a huge amount of work done on them in the late 19th century, and then there were sporadic works done over the next 50 years maybe, but very little pointed work in that area. And if you read a lot of the early researchers, you do note that they often will say, like, these accounts are almost repetitive. They're almost too similar to each other. We could imagine boring the reader with these accounts. And I read that and I thought, well, I think I'm not bored of reading these accounts. Maybe there's a lot of other people who want to read many accounts, so I'll put them all in one place. That's all.
I think that is a very important point you're making, that there is a difference between seeing or hearing someone who you believe to be alive in that moment, and seeing someone that you already know has passed. And I think that that's the interesting thing there. Because even in situations where you're expecting the person to pass, to know that they have passed in the moment when they have passed, because that moment is corroborated later, I think that that is a very significant experience.
It absolutely is. And you make a great point, because, I mean, one of the criticisms often level at experiences of these kinds are that, like, the general after-death communication, for example, or the deathbed vision, that the individual may be, they may be sedated, they may be influenced by these kind of drugs, or they may have such a so-called wish fulfillment, or what is a very real phenomenon, the bereavement-induced hallucination, for example. The problem is with the crisis apparition, you cannot ascribe any of those external factors to the origin of the crisis apparition, because the individual had no expectation that this experience would occur. In fact, in many cases, in the most ideal cases, the individual was convinced that the person who appears to them was fine at the time, actually. So for that synchronicity to occur, it would be even more powerful for those people. But yeah, that sets the crisis apparition fundamentally apart from the kind of battery of apparitional experiences. And it would be why it is one of the more important for those who are interested in the question of survival, I would say. Because you simply cannot casually ascribe them to coincidence, or sorry, to expectation or wish fulfillment, because there was no expectation. If anything, the expectation was defied.
Yes, of course. Why aren't we all having these? Is it that there's a certain type of person who's more likely to be able to receive? Or is it the nature of the person who's passing that determines that they're going to make themselves appear? Because I would imagine that many people would wish on their moment of passing to appear to their loved ones, to reassure them, and to say, I'm here, or I love you, or, see you again soon, or sometime. So given that that's the case, although we said this is relatively common, it's not exactly happening to everybody.
No.
So is it that some people are more receptive than others? Is it that those who are passing have a particular belief already that enables them to know how to do this? So what have you found? Are there any hints?
Yeah, there are many hints, and it's an interesting question because, like, first of all, yes, there do seem to be one thing that comes out very strongly in the folklore related to these experiences is that yes, there are certain people who are very specifically receptive to these kinds of experiences. And even then, we can go to the near death literature. And there are accounts, for example, of soldiers who die, and they will say that, like, I wanted to go and see somebody and tell them what was happening, but I couldn't. I just didn't have the capacity. But they kind of understand in that moment that other people actually may have that capacity. It's interesting. It kind of comes from all different angles, and so it's not necessarily either or. It seems to be that some people are more receptive. This comes out in people who have so-called second sight, or these other types of the third eye, for example. These different types of terminologies, they kind of reference these seemingly set apart individuals. But the same is also, it also seems to be that even the individual who is dead or dying, even at times they can't make contact when they want to. And then we could go even further than that and suggest that maybe we're not all meant to have these experiences. Maybe only certain people are meant to have these experiences. Maybe it's not for everyone. Maybe we have specific life paths that say this experience isn't going to be part of yours. This type of comfort. Now, these experiences can bring amazing comfort and just an entirely, it eases it truly does ease the passing of somebody for a lot of people, like in a way that is hard to really get across unless you experience it. But at the same time, and this is just speculation, but it could be that some people are not meant to necessarily have that comfort right now in their life. I hate to say that, but it seems to be, it is just, whatever way the universe works, it could be that whoever has it and whoever doesn't is very specific, and there's a good reason for it. And it could be important to keep that in mind if you become pessimistic about not necessarily having had an experience of this kind, for example, because there could be a good reason for that also.
Mediums often say that they don't want to do a reading for someone very close to a bereavement. And they will say that there are different reasons for that. One of them being that the person who's parted may not be ready to come forward, that there could be, a lot of energy that's grief energy coming from the person who's grieving. So there's a number of different factors at play. And yet, I had the experience of about 3 weeks before my father passed, arranging for a reading. And so I had that appointment, which happened in the end to be the very day after he passed. And he was, I remember the medium saying, I'm finding it very difficult to get this energy, to be very clear and strong. And I remember her saying, I think he's passed recently. And I said, yes. And she just kept feeling into that energy. And she said, I don't think it's been a week. And I said, yep, that's right. But she still got him. He was still there. She was still able to talk about what happened in those last hours and the awareness that he had of what I was doing for him, etc. So he was there. But I always put that down to the fact that he was a spiritualist and he would have known what to do. Maybe he was just building up, it's a bit harder to do it straight away. But I have come across this before, where some people do manage to be able to come through. And also, anyone sitting in a spiritualist church will have heard mediums talk about somebody being there, but actually bringing in the energy of someone else who has recently passed.
Yeah.
So, yes, I guess what I'm saying is I get what you're saying about perhaps not everyone being able to do that when they pass. Uh,
Yeah, that's a perfect anecdote to illustrate that. And thanks for sharing that, by the way. That's like it's interesting because you could even kind of say it as even as simply as, even now here in our kind of waking earth life, we all just have certain skills and capacities. There are certain things you can do that I can't do, and likewise. And it's always the same. It could be just a case of that. We just have specific capacities that are inherent. Now, maybe it is a little bit beyond that, but I'm just saying we could say even just at least that. And yeah, so that's in there. Okay, so actually, this is something that came to my mind, was that like one of the kind of persistent findings of psychical research in general over the last like 100 years is that the success of of the related experiments, for example, it's tied directly to the individual's actual belief in psi. Okay, so that's very interesting. Like the more somebody believes in it, the more likely the experiment is going to be successful. For example, the Gansfeld experiments. This came up there, and many others, which I can't name off the top of my head right now. But it is certainly one of the most persistent findings. And my point being that this could play into the types of experiences that you're speaking about, where because you mentioned your father may have, already had something in mind where he may have thought this was possible, and you see this even with some of the very early psychical researchers like Frederick Myers, for example, one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research. When he like the idea was like his idea was that, sorry, many of these research ideas were that when they died they would kind of come back, and the basis upon which they said that was their research. They actually knew, and therefore perhaps it is more likely that they will make contact if they do believe in such things. So yeah, there is a kind of a spectrum there, and it's mysterious, but not entirely. It's not entirely something that we can't dig into,
it's so hard to say, isn't it?
Mm.
And then there are those who say that it takes a great deal of energy for spirit to come through, even through mediums. That there is a certain amount of energy that's required for them to, or they have to work hard to lower their frequency enough to match ours. So I think that's an interesting concept as well. Um, but
It is.
certainly, this is a fascinating area to explore.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps like there are many accounts of crisis apparitions where the individual will see the full form, or they may just see the top half of somebody, or they may just see the head or the face. Like maybe how much is seen is directly tied to, like you're speaking of, the amount of energy needed, or that the individual is capable of either receiving, or that the apparitional form is capable of projecting. For example, this is something that you do read in psychical research also. But the thing is with these apparitions and visions, like that doesn't necessarily matter. It is interesting, don't get me wrong, but the fact of the distant death can come through something as simple as a sound, as simple as a voice, or as simple as a visualization. And actually, I should mention too that many times the apparition appears with some sort of like symbolic or allegorical representation of the death itself. And this could even be something as simple as, like, there was one example of a woman whose grandmother appeared with her travel bag, and just, or for instance, somebody appeared with train tickets, and the idea is that a journey is being represented, symbolically. And something that I find interesting is that that's something actually we read very commonly on the deathbed, also on the deathbed too. On the deathbed, people speak in the language of the journey. They will say that, get the boat ready, get the train ready, get the car ready, get the, you know, I have to get everything packed away because I'm going to be leaving soon. And actually, a little side note, they may know the exact day they're going to die, but that is a mystery in and of itself, and something that I go into in the next book. But yeah, it's there is a space in consciousness where these things can occur, where information at a distance seems to be able to make its way into the consciousness of the individual. Exactly how, we don't know, Whether or not it happens, it seems to be the case. It's not to say that every case that claims it happens in, but in terms of the crisis apparition, it would be very challenging to dismiss the many thousands of voices in this regard. It would be very challenging.
I like the many thousands of voices. That's very, um, I guess, reassuring for those who have had experiences that they can't explain.
Absolutely.
So you've used different terms. You've talked about apparitions, you've talked about visions, you've talked about dreams. Dreams are pretty self-explanatory, but can you distinguish between a vision and an apparition for everyone?
Well, you know, honestly, kind of no. And the reason is that like an apparition essentially is a vision, but it's hard to. The thing is, it comes down to terminology and the individual because, for instance, somebody there may be somebody who let me put it this way, okay? There is work, for instance, the work of Hilary Evans. He wrote a great book called Seeing Ghosts. I would recommend it for anyone interested in experience encounters with the paranormal with ghosts. Like many accounts do seem to suggest that the apparition has some sort of physical aspect to them, some sort of physicality. They may cast a reflection or a shadow or something. But I should say that many accounts also show the opposite. Okay, there is a kind of intriguing kind of contradictoriness to this mystery, and it's like I wouldn't have it any other way almost because it's just kind of it's more fun that way, I suppose. But not to make light of these fascinating experiences, but um, but to use that to speak to your initial question, the point being that if somebody has the experience of the apparition with the more physical aspects, they may not consider that to be a vision at all. However, somebody who has the apparition, the more wraith-like, the more gossamer, the more kind of even we could say see-through, because obviously in some cases apparitions are see-through, they may consider that simply a vision. And but I will say that again, one interesting thing about apparitions is that they are often extremely solid and entirely indistinguishable from real people. And it's to the extent that these people often don't realize they've even seen an apparition or what they consider to be an apparition until they actually hear of the death later. I remember one case in particular. It was reported by Patricia Pearson, Julia Mossbridge, and apologies, but a third author in a particular paper on the history of crisis apparitions, a shorter paper, um, where a woman she just walked past. I think it was her grandfather, just walked past him in the street, and he kind of uncharacteristically ignored her. But she discovered later that he had actually died at that exact moment. Okay, so this is something else that's interesting about the crisis apparition is that it's often very unembellished. It's not necessarily dramatic. It's not this wild, crazy ghost story. And that comes out in the tales too, by the way. I should note that comes out in the historical accounts. There are Mayan accounts, for example, the exact same. Like I had an account from a Mayan village where the, the a woman, she walked outside and she just saw her husband engaged in his general daily activities related to grain production, I believe. It wasn't until later she discovered he had actually died outside the village at that time. The same is true in like a Filipino account, for example. In the Philippines, a man was walking home. He was can't remember what he was bringing home, but he had a barrel and he was bringing it home and he met his wife on the street. And I can't remember exactly what they said to each other, but he discovered later she had died at that exact same time. The point being that these experiences are not, it's not only that they're not embellished or necessarily dramatic, but that also comes out in the tales, which again gives credence to suggesting the connections between these accounts through time.
Love that. Your book talks also about magic. So, what is the link with magic here?
Well, when I use the term, oh, sorry, apologies. There we go. When I use the term magic in this book, it's kind of, it is in a kind of a romantic sense, because I do consider there to be magic in like every moment and just the universe and just everything. And like these experiences, I'm not using it in necessarily the traditional cultic sense, in a strict sense, like Eliphas Levi's and stuff like this. But yeah, I just think that like I think there was a chapter, Magic Things Broken and the Legends of the Life Token, for example. Like that is really just a reference to the magic of these experiences. Like these life token experiences of that chapter, for example, are another form of an intimation of a distant death. Those can be, we've probably all heard the classic tale of, for example, the picture frame falling at the moment that the person in the picture frame died at a distance, or the grandfather clock stopping, for example, at the moment that somebody at it who owned the clock died at a distance. In fact, there's a famous song written about one of these experiences. It's called Grandfather Clock. I believe Johnny Cash sang the song, but it was inspired by a story he heard much earlier. And that song actually does detail such an experience. And what my book does is it says, I believe that those experiences, we can find those in the past also, but it's not with grandfather clocks and it's not with picture frames. It's with other items of personal belonging or apparel, for example. Like in India, a scarf that's very special to a woman may fall from the mantelpiece, and it's just at the very time she died at a distance. Or you could go to Alaska among the Inupiat, for example, and find that they have a very specific type of snowshoe, and the person who owned that snowshoe dies at a distance, and the snowshoe falls from the mantelpiece at the time. So we see these connections between something personal to the individual being affected at the time they die. It's basically psychokinetic, which is one of the kind of 3 or 4 main forms of what's called psi. And it's so interesting to see those exact types of experiences so widely spread. And I even then go into like the romances. I go into the Middle Ages and I look at the stories and I say, there are so many accounts like from Italy and France of princes and princesses, and they may say, take this ring. When it changes color, you'll know that I'm in trouble. Or when it breaks, you'll know that I'm dead. And then you can go to Aboriginal Australia and Africa and see the same thing. You can see somebody planting a stick in the ground outside the home and saying, when this stick falls, that's when you know I'm in trouble. The same theme. It comes across a little differently per culture, but the same theme comes across very powerfully. And that's something that I did enjoy with that chapter, even though I thought that that might be the most boring chapter for people. I personally really enjoyed it.
I don't think it is the most boring. I think that's why I brought it up, because there's something very intriguing. We know about psychometry, psychometry being where someone who is psychic or mediumistic can pick up from an object that was personal to someone,
Mm.
their story, and tell things about them. So it's another interesting thing, and the idea that our energy does get put into things, particularly things that mean something to us. Um, it's it's not boring at all. It is one of those fascinating mysteries of life, isn't it?
It really is. And like what's interesting there, it's so interesting that you bring up psychometry, because I didn't really think too strongly of that when I was researching that chapter. But yeah, it's a very interesting connection to make. And it made me think then even further that like something that's really common in psi research also is the fact that these experiences tend to happen most commonly and most powerfully between people who have the most powerful connections with each other. There's love and its gradients. um, so if psi is related, if the kind of magnitude of psi is related to the extent to which two people are connected, it would make sense that it would potentially be the case with external objects and items also. So there could be kind of a connection there that's being made. So yeah, that's very interesting. And you also, when we were just talking about all the different ways in which the life tokens turn up, it made me just want to also note that like it, it's I just when I became familiar with this phenomenon and I became interested in it and I started to read account after account, I just knew that I would find these accounts everywhere. I knew that they would have to be everywhere because they're so common, they're so similar. I knew that I just had a feeling that if I looked for them, I'd find them, and thankfully I did, and they turned up everywhere. They turned up in as the book cover says, in legend, lyric, and lore. They turned up in the poetry, the border poetry of Scotland and England. They turn up in, as we mentioned, Egyptian stele. They turn up. There are references to not necessarily direct not necessarily direct experiences among the Sumerians, but there are references to the capacity for the experiences. For example, there are many references on tablets, Sumerian tablets, to encounters with ghosts that you don't know, as you'd actually are not familiar with them. So by definition, you could be seeing someone you didn't actually know was even dead. So that's just, but yeah, just to note that I kind of, because I just knew that if I looked for them, I would find them. Yeah, not to ramble on that point, but yeah, you get you get the idea.
Well, it is a wonderful book to read, and it is, if nothing else, a wonderful reminder of how mysterious life is, whether we're thinking about loved ones appearing to say goodbye, or whether we're thinking about objects that perhaps they have moved themselves, because that's a possibility, or whether the object itself has some of their energy within it. It doesn't matter. It's the mysterious nature that you are exploring here, and
Absolutely.
reassuring anyone who has had interesting experiences that this is actually more normal than you would think.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
thank you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Anna. I appreciate that.
And the book we are discussing is this one, Apparitions at the Moment of Death. And I'll be putting a link to it in the description box. And Daniel, if people want to find out more about you and your work, how do they do that?
They can find me at near_death_FE on X. And from there, you'll find all my links. And you can also find the book on, I should note, on my publisher's website, Inner Traditions, and Amazon. So yeah, that's where you'll find me.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for watching. A reminder that in the description box, you will also find my own website and the link to Substack. Until then, goodbye. Until next time, goodbye.